Oh.
Is upgrading your budget planer with a fancy helical head really worth it like everyone says?
I upgraded to the...
and put it on our new helical head.
Helical Cutter head.
I got one from FindByTool, which is one of the best priced on the market. But after testing it with my DeWalt lunchbox planer on 6 different materials, I'm now questioning who actually would benefit from an upgrade like this. FindByTool did send me this for free. They might not like though what I have to say about this upgrade. So we are doing a before and after test with 6 different materials. Pine, 3 different hardwoods, an end grain cutting board, and even epoxy. I will walk you through the whole installation process, and in the end we calculate how long it would actually take an average woodworker like you and I to recoup the money spent on this upgrade. While we are prepping our test materials for this project, let me walk you through the biggest difference between the straight blade and the helical cutter head design. Looking at my DeWalt 735 planer with its factory setup, it uses 3 long straight blades that span the entire width of the cutter head. When these blades hit your workpiece, they make contact across the full width all at once. This design has been around forever, but it has some real drawbacks. The entire board will be cut in one go. It's kind of like trying to chop through a log with one big axe swing. It takes a lot of force. The straight blades can also have a pretty short lifespan. They get dull fast, especially if you're working with harder materials. And here's the worst part. If you accidentally hit a nail or staple hidden in your wood, you will ruin the entire blade. Now let's look at the helical head I'm installing today. The design is completely different. Instead of 3 long blades, it has 56 individual carbide cutters arranged in a spiral pattern across the entire cutting head. This helical design is really clever because it means only a few cutters contact the wood at any given moment. One of the coolest features of these carbide cutters is that each one has 4 usable sides. When one edge gets dull, you don't throw away the whole thing. You just loosen a screw, rotate the cutter 90 degrees, and you have got a fresh edge ready to go. You can do this 4 times before you need to replace any individual cutters. And if you do hit a nail or a staple, you only damage the few cutters that made contact, not the entire cutting surface. The way these cutters are positioned creates a totally different cutting action too. With straight blades, you're chopping down into the wood fibers, but the helical head creates more of a slicing or shearing action as it contacts the wood. You get a much cleaner cut with less tearing. Supposedly. You might be wondering why I'm so excited about making an end grain cutting board and an epoxy charcuterie board just to run them through this planer. Well, these aren't just random test pieces. They are essentially the kryptonite for planers. Most woodworking expert will tell you to never ever put end grain through a planer. There's a good reason for that warning. When you feed end grain through a planer, you're forcing the machine to cut against the grain structure in the worst possible way. The wood fibers tend to splinter and tear out rather than cut cleanly. This doesn't just ruin your workpiece, it can actually be dangerous. The planer can grab the board and actually throw it back at you with incredible force. I'm taking a calculated risk here, but don't try this at home. The epoxy charcuterie board is another monster altogether. I've combined blue epoxy with a live edge Camper board that has different grain direction running through it. This creates a double challenge. The planer has to deal with the wood grain changing directions and at the same time cutting super hard epoxy. Epoxy is incredibly hard on cutting edges. It doesn't have a grain structure like wood. So instead of cutting, the blades are essentially scraping against an extremely hard substance that can chip or dull them almost immediately. Okay, so now finally we have prepped all our material. So what we will be testing is going to be simple 2x4. Then this is Pacific Maple, which is a softer hardwood. Very easy to work with, super easy to stain. Now the next thing is, actually I can't remember what that is, but it's a hardwood, gum tree anyway. Then we have a piece of Chara, super hard, super dense, very splintery. So that's the next level up. Then we have our end grain cutting board, which is gonna be extremely difficult. And then I think the most difficult thing is gonna be the epoxy board. The pine will show us a baseline performance on easy materials, while the harder woods will reveal how each system handles increasing levels of difficulties before we hit them with the truly challenging end grain and epoxy test. With our test pieces ready, it's time to see what those factory blades can really do. I want to be fair in this comparison, so I'm using the unused edge of my factory blades to match the new conditions of the helical cutters, comparing apples to apples. For all these tests, I'm using the planer on setting 1 and take light passes. Just a quarter turn on depth, then a half turn for the second pass. Let's start with the pine, which should be pretty easy to plane. Running the 2x4 through, the result looks really good. The surface is smooth and consistent across the board. When I run my fingers across, it almost feels slick and the board has a sheen on it. It basically feels like sanded to a high grit. I really can't imagine that this can get any better. Moving to the Pacific Maple, which is our softer hardwood test. Again, the straight blades handle it super well. The surface looks clean through it, though I noticed the edges are a little bit more aggressive than with the 2x4. Nothing major though, the surface feels super nice. Now for that gumtree wood, I can't remember which exact species that is, but you can immediately hear the motor working way harder. Surprisingly, the surface actually comes out smoother than the maple in some ways. At least it feels like that way. Things get a little bit more interesting with the Chara test piece. This is where we start seeing the first tiny issues. While the main surface looks fantastic, the edges show some small splintering. The straight blades are chopping rather than slicing the wood fibers, and it's most obvious along the edge where tiny chunks are breaking off instead of being cleanly cut. So now for the moment of truth, the end grain cutting board.
And I'm already a bit terrified because you shouldn't put this through a planer with straight knives, or in general through a planer, because end grain really tears. So let's see how that goes. I just hope that that test piece doesn't explode in the planer right now. Would be a shame, but yeah. Anyway, let's try it.
Some rough tear out, especially at the tailing edge, where some wood chips ripped off completely. The surface also feels really rough. The factory knives really struggled there. Finally, the epoxy charcuterie board. I was actually surprised that this didn't go worse. The straight blades managed to cut the epoxy without major issues. But there are some small chip outs and you can see the marks of the blades clearly on the epoxy and feel them too. But it really struggled with the different grain directions in the live edge board. The surface feels really rough where the grain direction changes. So far, very impressive with the factory setup and the brand new straight blades. I know for a fact though, epoxy really chews through the sharpness of tools. I would expect if I would run through a ton of these boards, the blades would dull much quicker. The best upgrades require most work, and this one means completely gutting the planer. What most tutorials don't show you is how many tools you actually need before you start. You need a 5mm hex key, a Phillips screwdriver, snap ring pliers, internal and external, a wrench, and even a 6mm socket or adjustable wrench. After a trip to Bunnings, I've got everything sorted. The first step is the obvious one. I'm unplugging my DeWalt. Safety first, especially when you are taking apart a $1,000 machine that still has that new tool smell. My planer is only 6 months old, so I'm basically throwing away the warranty right now. But hey, that's the price of progress, right? With the power disconnected, I'm removing the top cover and the dust shroud. These come off pretty easily with just a few screws. But now comes the nerve-wracking part, taking off the side covers to get at the chains and the gears that drive the cutter head. There are a ton of small parts here and I'm super careful to keep everything organized. And I would recommend you to do the same. Those tiny springs and snap rings are just waiting for a chance to disappear into the black hole under my workbench. The trickiest part is definitely removing the old cutter head. The manual from FindByTool suggests using a mallet and a hardwood block to tap out the cutter head. I'm not gonna go full ballistic on this one, I'm just trying to tap it out, but there is some force that you have to apply. I'm moving the shaft a little at a time. It's like performing surgery. Except my patient is made out of cast iron and aluminium and some plastic, I guess. With the old head out, I can finally see what I'm working with. The new helical head comes with bearings already installed, which is a huge time saver. but getting everything lined up perfectly is crucial. The bearings need to seat properly into their housing before I can even think about putting the gears and the chains back on. Putting everything back together feels like running the disassembly process in reverse. All those gears, chains and covers need to go back exactly the way they were. Now for the most tedious part, which is installing all 56 carbide cutter heads onto the helical head. Each tiny cutter needs to be seated correctly into the cutter head so that you get a smooth surface. So be careful and take your time there. The cool thing is that each of these cutters has 4 sides and 4 corners are marked. So I'm orientating them all the same way so that I know which edge I used. And when I turn them, I always turn them in the same direction. This gives me then full control of how many sides I've used from each and every cutter. It's very cool because it's like getting 4 blades in one. For now, I'm making sure that they're all facing the same direction and tightening them to the correct torque. I started using my impact drill, which wasn't fantastic, so I actually switched to the provided tool, which actually worked much better. But be careful guys, those cutters are really sharp and they will cut you. The instruction manual from FindByTool is, well, let's say it's not winning any awards for clarity, but thankfully they have a YouTube channel where they have a video that talks about the step-by-step process much more detailed than I did here. If you're planning to do this upgrade yourself, I definitely recommend watching this video. I will link it in the description below.
Wow, it's way quieter.
After spending hours on this upgrade and putting everything back together, it is time for the moment everyone skips ahead to, the actual performance test. So let's put this upgrade to the test with the same pieces that we tried with the straight ones and see if it actually makes a difference in the cutting performance. First up is the Pine 2x4. I run it through the same settings as before, looking at it side by side with the straight blade results. There is a difference, but honestly, it's not something that I would have noticed without really looking for it. The only difference really is that the helical head doesn't leave those really subtle lines, but for the basic pine board, both cutting systems did perfectly. Moving on to the Pacific Maple, I'm seeing almost the exact same results. The helical head gives a nice finish, but it's not dramatically better than the straight blades delivered. Things are getting a little bit more interesting with this gum tree board I have. Surprisingly, the helical head is actually causing some cracks in the wood. This might be because of this particular piece or section of the wood that is a bit splintery, but it's definitely not what I expected. The surface quality is otherwise extremely similar between both of the cutting systems. With the Chara test piece, we finally see our first real improvement. The helical head gives a noticeable cleaner cut with less splintering along the long edges. The shearing action of the carbide cutter heads really helped with the difficult grain. Now for the moment of truth, the end grain cutting board. I'm already nervous sending that through again. The helical head still struggles with the challenge, as does every planer, but there is a definite improvement in the surface quality. The tear-out is similar as we saw with the straight blades. The surface is much smoother to the touch, even though it doesn't look like that in the camera right now. You can feel it's a huge difference. The final test with the epoxy charcuterie board shows one of the biggest improvements. I know in the video it looks a little worse than the straight blade, but when you run your hand over it, the difference is obvious. The lines from the helical head are way smoother in the epoxy, and it handles the different grain direction way better. It's still not perfect, obviously, but this is where the shearing cut of the helical design really shows its value. One thing I noticed, how much quieter the helical head runs. The reduction in noise is nice, but it's not a huge value added into your workshop. You still need to wear ear protection. But here's the question. Is dropping over $300 or 500 Australians on a helical head actually worth it? Let's break down the numbers and see if the investment makes sense for your specific situation. The FindByTool helical head we tested costs around 500 Australians. Most competing helical heads cost $200 to $300 more. So we are starting already with a budget-friendly option. Now let's look what you're currently spending on those straight blades. A new set of replacement knives for the D-Welt costs $99 on Amazon right now. Most regular woodworkers replace these blades about once a year when they get dull. The carbide cutters are completely different. These little guys last anywhere from 4 to 10 times longer. Some say 40 times. Seeing means believing. Let's say 4 times longer. But remember, each one has 4 cutting edges instead of the 2 of the factory blades. When one edge gets dull, you just rotate in 90 degrees and you've got a fresh cutting edge. A 10-pack of replacement cutters costs about 30 to 40 bucks, and you might only need to replace a few at a time. This means you can spread out the replacement cost over many years. When you crunch the numbers, the helical head starts to make financial sense after about 5 years of use, which is a long time. One of the biggest advantages that doesn't show up in the basic math is what happens when you hit something that you shouldn't, like a nail or a staple. With straight blades, one tiny nail ruins your entire cutting blade. But with the helical head, you might only damage 1 or 2 cutters. So who is this helical head upgrade actually for? After all our testing, I believe it's perfect for 3 types of woodworkers. First, if you're running your planer constantly and you can't justify a commercial machine, this upgrade will save you a ton of money over time. Second, if you work a lot with reclaimed timber, like your pellet punters, you will appreciate not having to replace entire blade sets when you hit a hidden metal. Here, I think it's a must-have. If you tackle a lot of challenging materials like epoxy or a lot of live edge projects, the helical head will give you noticeable better results. If you are in one of these categories and you're in the market to get a cutter head, I've linked this one in the description below, so check it out. It also will help out the channel a ton. But here's the honest truth. If you're just a weekend warrior, mostly running through dimensional lumber, I don't think the upgrade makes sense for you. The performance differences on standard materials is just not worth the $500 investment. Now you have seen how to upgrade a planer. Watch this video next where I upgraded my router to make it the perfect slab flattening solution. As always guys, I appreciate you and I see you next time. Boom chakalaka boom, boom boom, boom chakalaka boom, boom boom.